It's a little after 9, so just to respect everyone's time, I think we're going to get started. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Maureen McGuire. I'm the new CEO here at the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. And I replaced John Christ, who retired in January. And John has been working with Jody Schweitzer for years on this Ventura County Agricultural Irrigated Lands Group. And so we bring a lot of history to the conversation, and we want to share with you now what the new developments are and your opportunity to engage as landowners, farmers, or people who are interested in the long-term success of agriculture here in Ventura County. We're going to start with Jody Schweitzer, our water program director, who's going to give you a detailed overview of what the program is and what the opportunities are that exist to, and be involved in the democratic process and make sure that your voice is heard. We're also going to hear from Carrie Fisher, who works at the California Farm Bureau, who's worked, she's an attorney and she's worked on many different ag orders throughout the state and brings a statewide regulatory overview for us. Then I'll end and hopefully hype you guys up around getting involved, and we'll hear from a couple of growers. What we'd like to do for everyone who's in the chat, I think we have almost 80 people at the webinar. If you can put your questions in the chat, we'll be monitoring the questions. And then if you're in the room, we will likely hold the questions until the end. And Carrie and Jody and I will be here in order to make sure that all the relevant questions are batched and answered. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jody Schweitzer. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to kind of preface my comments by saying this isn't intended to be a comprehensive overview of the program and all of the challenges that we foresee coming in the ag order. But I'm going to try to give you a high-level overview and give you the details that you need to have the context to evaluate how important this is, the stakes that are coming, and then how you can remain engaged and involved in the process that's coming up next. So I'm going to try to stick to my notes so I don't get too long-winded here. But this is just a very quick overview of the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, which is at the state level and is overseen by the State Water Resources Control Board. So this regulatory program applies everywhere in California, but each of the 9 regional boards, they are the ones to develop and adopt that specific regulatory order that implements the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And that's why you're going to see some differences region to region. The orders might be called something different. So right now in our region, we have a conditional ag waiver. Other regions have an ag order, which is also known as a WDR, waste discharge requirements. So our region, let me see if I get this to work. We are right down here, this purple area, Region 4, also known as the Los Angeles region. And this encompasses both Los Angeles County and Ventura County, primarily. Another thing I want to mention is that no matter which region in the state you're located, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program applies to growers who irrigate commercial crops. So this is one of the commonalities. And they all regulate water that discharge or runoff, so we call it runoff, into surface water. And that includes both your irrigation tailwaters and your stormwater, as well as what leaches into groundwater. And the overarching goals of all of these regulatory orders are to control and prevent contaminants, to protect the beneficial uses of those receiving water bodies and then the underlying groundwater aquifers. Last common trait here that I'll mention is that all of the orders provide two options for compliance. So growers can comply as an individual, in which they work directly with their regional board, do all of their own monitoring, all of their own reporting, or they can join a coalition, which helps them do that on behalf of the members of that coalition. So here in Ventura County, we have the Ventura County Agricultural Irrigated Lands Group, which is administered by the Farm Bureau. And this group was first established in 2006, which was just after the first iteration of the conditional waiver adoption. So focusing in on our region and the current requirements that apply right now. So we have a conditional waiver, which is, the long name of this is conditional waiver of waste discharge requirements for discharges from irrigated lands. The waiver part of it mainly has to do with how you apply for coverage under that regulatory order. The conditions part of it really set all of the requirements. And generally speaking, they are very similar in a lot of ways, some other ways different to ag orders or WDRs. And Carrie Fisher with California Farm Bureau is going to go into a little bit more detail about the differences in these regulatory mechanisms. So we are currently in the third iteration of our conditional waiver. Whoop, I just pushed the wrong button there. Let's see, so we started here 2005 to 2010 with the first term. Second term came in 2010, and our current term that we are complying with was adopted in 2016. And regional board staff have notified us that they intend to move to an ag order for our next regulatory program, and that will come at the end of this year. So the current conditional waiver expires on December 31st of this year, and before that date, the regional board needs to replace it with an ag order. And so a little bit about VCALG and how we operate, what VCALG's responsibilities are versus what the responsibilities of the grower. VCALG conducts all of the water quality sampling. We do all of the special studies that are required, whether they're in receiving water bodies or groundwater special studies. We develop the water quality management plans that are updated every year and a half or so. We do all of the reporting to the regional board. And then we facilitate the education and outreach program. So growers are required to attend 2 hours per year of continuing education. And this is a program that we help facilitate. And then what growers and landowners are required to do is first maintain membership in VCALG. So that is paying your portion of the assessment for that program, helping to fund all of the things that VCALG is doing on behalf of those member growers. Reporting your BMP implementation. So we do those BMP surveys every year and a half or so to help inform the water quality management plan development. Attending those continuing education workshops that we do every year. And then finally, but most importantly, is implementing best management practices on the farm. And I will try to self-moderate and define these acronyms as I use them, but BMP is one that you're going to hear a lot. So that is best management practice. So this is a quick snapshot of our sampling program. And as you can see, these sub watersheds, which are delineated here, which we refer to as responsibility areas, they are assigned to a representative monitoring site, which you can see here indicated in green. So each area is assigned to that representative monitoring site. We sample at all of those sites 4 times per year. So that includes 2 dry season sampling events, 2 wet season sampling events. And we also do TMDL monitoring above and beyond what you're seeing here on this map. So we have TMDL monitoring sites that aren't shown here that also have to be visited at a higher frequency. And what happens at that representative monitoring site is then assigned to the growers within that responsibility area. So if we see a water quality exceedance at that site, the growers within those responsibility areas are directed to implement best management practices targeted at those exceedances. And the way this works is through an iterative BMP implementation process. So the conditional waiver right now requires that growers implement best management practices to the degree necessary to meet water quality objectives. And this is a little bit broad, but it's intended to be that way to acknowledge that crops, fields, operations are all different, and the same approach isn't going to work for every farm or ranch. And then VCALG provides a list of recommended BMPs that are targeted to address any water quality issues identified in those that grower's specific responsibility area. And then it's up to the grower to determine what's going to work best for their particular operation to address that water quality exceedance. And these recommendations are revised every time we update the water quality management plan. And that's based on updated water quality sampling and then evaluations of the effectiveness of current levels of BMP implementation. So that's when we're hearing from growers about what types of BMPs they're implemented, to what degree they are implementing them. We evaluate whether that is sufficient to achieve water quality objectives. If not, then there are increased BMP recommendations. And this is an iterative cycle that we continue to monitor, continue to refine these recommendations. But there are backstops that are incorporated into that iterative cycle. And those backstops take the form of TMDL compliant states. So TMDL is another acronym that I'm going to use a lot. It stands for total maximum daily load. And a TMDL, the easiest way to kind of understand it is a additional regulatory layer on top of the general conditional waiver water quality requirements. And they apply in areas where there is a listed impairment for that receiving water body. So the total maximum daily load is essentially a watershed plan that establishes a load that water body can accommodate and still meet its water quality objectives for its listed beneficial use. And then each type of discharger entity, so that might be agriculture, that might be the municipalities, wastewater treatment plants, whatnot, are assigned an allocation of that load. And that establishes your water quality objective. And in the 2016 conditional waiver, deadlines for those TMDLs, of which agricultural is listed as a responsible party, were included. And there's a lot of information right here on this slide. So the main thing I want to point out is you can see the number of TMDLs. You can see that they apply in every primary watershed in the county, and that the compliance states are coming due right now or in the very near future. And the consequence of these compliance states is that a one-time, just has to happen once, water quality exceedance of that TMDL water quality objective after that compliance date would trigger individual monitoring for all growers in that associated responsibility area. So what does individual monitoring mean? Once that trigger condition happens, all growers within that responsibility area would have to develop a monitoring and reporting plan within 3 months of that exceedance being reported to the regional board. So every December, we submit an annual monitoring report on behalf of VCALG. That report includes the previous year's sampling results. So if there is a sampling result in there that exceeded a water quality objective after that deadline came due, that would then kick off that 3-month timeline for growers within that responsibility area to develop their own field-specific monitoring and reporting plans for conducting their sampling. Edge of field sampling would need to be initiated the following wet or dry season. And wet or dry season would be determined based on what the initial exceedance condition happened in. So if that representative monitoring site exceeded during a wet event, then growers would need to do wet weather sampling during a storm. If it exceeded during a dry event, then growers would need to do dry weather sampling during any time when they had irrigation discharge coming off their field. And the grower would need to do that for 2 years until there is a 2-year period with no exceedance. So you have 2 years of clean sampling. And then the results would need to be reported annually by the grower to the regional board. And I could spend a lot of time talking about the challenges of implementing a program at that scale. But here are some of the main points. First is that it's infeasible to be conducted by VCALG. VCALG cannot deploy to potentially thousands of fields all at once during a storm event. We can't guarantee that we can be there while you have irrigation runoff. There is no opportunity to scale those costs in a way that would be advantageous to have a group do that on your behalf. So this would have to be something that a grower would do themselves. And that means they would have to conduct their own sampling, and then they would coordinate with any laboratory directly to have their sample analyzed. And then also many of the water quality objectives are expressed in loads rather than concentrations. So that involves calculating your flow off of your field and a more complicated calculation and reporting process than just a straight up concentration. And then it's also important to point out that edge of field discharge is highly variable. Agriculture is a non-point source of discharge, and sampling at a single point in time is not representative of the discharge that is coming off of that field. So there's a lot of question about the value of doing anything like this. One sample once a year, and that's your point of compliance. And then I also want to point out that this is a regulatory approach at this scale that is not taken in other regions. And Carrie Fisher is going to talk a little bit more about that. And lastly, on this slide, I want to point out some additional context to these requirements in that they were added very late in the process during the 2016 conditional waiver adoption. I believe we saw an administrative draft about 6 weeks before the adoption hearing. 4 weeks before that adoption hearing, growers could submit comments for that, but there was no opportunity to engage meaningfully and have discussions about alternative approaches to this type of regulatory approach. So this upcoming ag order development is our opportunity to talk through this more with the regional board and to get them to evaluate alternative approaches that would be effective. And I think that's the key here. So to give you a better idea of the scale of these requirements, I have just a few maps highlighting some upcoming TMDLs, one in each of the main watersheds. So this is the Cayugas Creek watershed, and this TMDL here that I'm showing the compliance site determination based on is the toxicity, chlorpyrifos, and diazinon TMDL. So you can see each of the circles indicates a sampling site. So this is a compliant site for that TMDL. If it's red, that means within the last 2 years, we have had an exceedance of that load allocation. And it's not an indication of the degree of exceedance or anything over an averaging period. This is just, was there an exceedance in the last 2 years? Because this is what the current threshold is any exceedance triggers this entire edge of field monitoring program to be initiated. And I think this is an important point of discussion with the regional board, is that any one-off exceedance kicking off a requirement of this scale isn't practicable and isn't supported by science. So here you can see the responsibility areas, and you can see the sites that are indicated in red. So the responsibility areas encompassing those sites could potentially see edge of field monitoring as a result of this TMDL compliance date coming due. And that compliance date just came due this past March. Then we have the McGrath Lake OC pesticides. We're talking about legacy pesticides and PCB TMDL. And one important note here that I wanted to point out is that this TMDL technically only applies to the small drainage area to McGrath Lake, which is indicated right here in this kind of pink shaded area. But the way that the regulation was written doesn't account for that. The requirements were written in a way that could set off individual monitoring for legacy pesticides within this entire responsibility area set outlined in black here. And then moving over to Santa Clara River. So the nitrogen compounds TMDL, again, you can see the sites that have at any point once or more exceeded that load allocation in the last 2 years. And then finally, the Ventura River algae TMDL. So the lower reach there of the Ventura River that has exceeded within the last 2 years. This compliance date has come due. The 2 sites within the upper portion of the watershed within the last 2 years haven't exceeded, but they have at one point before then. And I just want to point out the incredibly low thresholds there. So we're talking about 5 milligrams per liter as nitrate as nitrogen as the load allocation in those upper reaches. And that is half of the drinking water MCL. So our primary concerns, those maps that I just outlined gives a pretty good illustration of our primary concerns. And this is just whittled down to kind of our three main topics of concern here. First is the timing. So as I described before, conditional waivers are renewed every 5 years. Ag orders are not. Those are long-term programs. So we're looking at moving to an ag order. It means the requirements that are going to be built into this ag order are going to be long-term. There won't be an opportunity to open that up for review and renewal every 5 years in the way that there are conditional waivers. And then individual monitoring. So I outlined our primary concerns there. The staff in our conversations with them have insisted that this is needed for enforcement, and they are drafting an ag order on that basis. A couple of things to point out here is that there is little enforcement of the current program requirements already. So just, are you enrolled in the program? Are you submitting your BMP reporting information? Are you attending your continuing education classes? So adding substantial new requirements with no additional enforcement capacity poses a significant challenge for the viability of this program. And then also the best actors who voluntarily comply with individual monitoring without needing to be enforced upon by the regional board will be the focus of that enforcement. So this only incentivizes non-compliance, and voluntary participation in VCALG could quickly unravel. And this is a coalition that growers have invested in building over the last 15 years and has been really successful. So that is a concern as well. Lastly is just whether this is even an effective approach to addressing water quality issues. So finer scale monitoring is not going to improve water quality, and opportunities to build an enforceable and effective program have been presented to regional board staff, but were rejected. So last year, we met with regional board staff almost monthly. We outlined quite a few proposals for things that we anticipated as being a challenge in the upcoming ag order. And this was one point that we just could not get to consent with them on. They were adamant that edge of field monitoring is needed for enforcement. And the last thing that I'll note here, and this is a bit of our success story in our conversations with the regional board. This is a requirement that we know will be added into the ag order. We had meetings, we made proposals, and we got to consent on quite a few of the proposals that we made. So this is regarding the East San Joaquin, which we call the ESJ, precedential requirements. And this is precedential for all irrigated lands programs through the state. They were promulgated by the State Water Resources Control Board back in 2018. And the state board said all irrigated lands programs throughout California need to include these requirements in their next iteration of their regulatory orders. So what this means is significant nitrogen tracking and reporting requirements will be coming in the upcoming ag order. And that will require an irrigation and nutrient management plan to be developed for all operations. So right now we have a similar requirement for nitrogen management plans to be required in watersheds that have an identified nutrient exceedance in their water quality sampling. This will expand that requirement to apply to all operations throughout the county, throughout the state eventually as well. They'll be required to develop these plans to have them certified. So we have a training program to become self-certified if you attend the training program and pass the test, or growers can work with a CCA or a technical service provider like NRCS, technical service providers. And then most importantly is summary information from that irrigation and nutrient management plan will be required to be reported. So that summary information will include how much nitrogen are you applying to your crop, how much nitrogen is being removed in harvest, what types of nutrient management practices are you implementing, what types of irrigation management practices are you implementing. There will be a summary reporting form developed. And again, that will have to be reported. And that's a significant change from right now, where the plan is just a management plan that growers keep on hand to inform their management practices. These are essentially a summary of the precedential components, but there's a lot of discretion that the regional board can apply as to exactly how they get implemented. And that is really the basis of the proposals that we made to them. So to say, rather than reporting publicly to the regional board, we proposed a reporting program that would involve reporting to VCALG, where we can then anonymize the data and identify outliers in that nitrogen applied versus removed differences, and then work with those growers to bring them the education and technical service guidance services that they would need to help refine their nutrient management practices. So that brings me to our opportunities. As I said, when it comes to individual monitoring, that's not something that we could get to consent with staff, but that doesn't mean it's not an option anymore. These are still issues that we can bring to the regional board. And when the current conditional waiver was extended through the end of the year, Maureen McGuire and myself, we made comments to the regional board to ask them for a meaningful stakeholder engagement process that involved public workshops where we would be able to get in front of the board to make our case for a better approach to some of these current regulatory requirements. We also asked for workshops for growers, which is something that has been lacking in any of these conditional waiver renewal processes, where growers have not been outreached to by the regional board staff directly, where an opportunity we provided for growers to ask questions and provide their feedback directly as well. So our alternative proposal involved creating a compliance pathway that incentivizes meaningful action by focusing on field level assessment and implementation rather than field level sampling. So we're saying collecting additional samples at the field level is not going to address any water quality issue. If there are areas where there are water quality issues, let's do field level assessment. Let's bring in technical service providers who can work with those growers to really make recommendations that are going to have meaningful outcomes. This provides flexibility so growers can opt in and comply with that program, or they can always just do individual monitoring if that's their choice. It also provides that field level guidance. So those subject matter experts are the ones who would be making those recommendations. And then also it leverages the existing assistance programs and partnerships with some of these local and federal agencies that we work with frequently. Most importantly, it leads to immediate action. Individual monitoring might show a grower that they have a single point in time exceedance, but then what do they do with that? This alternative pathway identifies potential issues and leads to immediate action. And then also quite importantly is compliance assurance. So compliance expectations and required actions would be clearly defined. And then the assurances would be provided to allow for that significant investment and participation in regional projects. Right now, if a grower were to invest significantly on a field level project or participate in a regional project, they aren't guaranteed compliance, even if they make that significant infrastructure investment. They could still see an edge of field exceedance and would be in the same situation as had they done nothing. And this is my final slide here. So the anticipated schedule. One ongoing thing that we are trying to do is reach out to the regional board members themselves and offer farm tours. Maureen and I just last week gave a farm tour to one of our board members. But one thing to point out here is it is a 7-member board. There is 1 vacancy right now. So there are 6 seated members. 5 of those 6 are all LA folks. So they live in urban Los Angeles. They don't really know much about Ventura County, particularly Ventura County agriculture. So getting those people out into a field, hearing from growers about what challenges they're facing is a really important part of this outreach strategy. And then coming up in just 2 weeks from now, and this is a tentative date because the regional board hasn't published their agenda yet, but this is the plan as of now, will be to hold a public workshop at the July 14th regional board meeting. And this will be our opportunity to get in front of the board to appeal for our, to essentially appeal for our alternative proposal. So to say what we believe will make a more effective regulatory program and why. And we will make a presentation to the board at that time. That's an opportunity for growers to make public comment or written comment. And the more voices we have to help support that message, the better. Early fall, and this is all a little bit tentative, but we expect the release of a tentative draft order. So this would be publicly released, open for public comment. And then at the same time, we anticipate the regional board would facilitate workshops for growers. So this would be an opportunity for the regional board to talk directly to the regulated community, to outline what they are proposing coming up in this regulatory program, and then to solicit feedback, questions from growers specifically. And then finally, in the late fall would be the adoption of the ag order. So December 8th is the last regional board meeting of the year, and they have to adopt something before the end of the year. So this would be their last opportunity to take action on this. So at some point before this. And that is the end of my slides. We're going to hold questions until the end, just based on time. And right now I will pass it over to Carrie Fisher, Senior Legal Counsel with California Farm Bureau. So she has a lot of experience on water quality or water issues in general, but specifically water quality issues, working with other regions of the state, and can give kind of a legal regulatory perspective.
Good morning, everyone. So again, my name is Carrie Fisher, and I have actually worked on every single irrigated lands program throughout the state, which is 8 of the 9 regions, because Lahontan does not have an irrigated lands program. And so I have been doing this for many, many years, seeing the adoptions of the conditional waivers that came about in the 2000s, and then the switch to ag orders or WDR. So I was just going to give a little bit of some more information on what we were seeing, what you guys can expect, and some of the other programs to kind of highlight what is going on. Next slide, please. So here's just a chart. It looks overwhelming, so you don't have to read it. I'll just explain a little bit of them. So a chart that just distinguishes between a WDR and a conditional waiver as they're seen in the water code, and how they're actually utilized by the regional boards. So one thing that applies to both is a waiver or a WDR cannot dictate the manner of compliance on how a grower meets a water quality objective. That is up to the grower, and allows growers to do what needs to be done and employ the management practices that are applicable to that field, that crop. However, there are things that can be, and the statute does require in both of them, and that's things like implementing the basin plan for the region, considering the beneficial uses, the water quality objectives, preventing nuisance. So those are pretty similar. One of the big differences we see, as Jody mentioned, between a WDR and a conditional waiver is the timeline. A WDR is an indefinite term. The statute does say it has to be periodically reviewed. It does not define what periodically is, so that is kind of up to the regional board. A conditional waiver has a maximum time of 5 years that can be renewed, but it has a statutory sunset after 5 years. There is a shift throughout the state to move every irrigated lands program to a WDR because of the staff time to constantly draft a new conditional waiver, and especially since certain state board items keep being precedential in nature, triggering the review and the renewal or the readoption of these programs. A lot of regional boards just can't constantly do the 5-year timeline. Now, time schedules is a very important component of any sort of irrigated lands program, because a time schedule recognizes that immediate compliance does not have to happen. And as we all know, as a non-point source program, immediate compliance is not something that can typically happen, because it's not an option of just turning off the pipe or diverting somewhere else, especially with the discharge into groundwater. So a WDR specifically mentions that a time schedule are allowed. The conditional waiver does not specifically mention that. In practice, regional boards have utilized them. Next slide, please. So monitoring, the heart of any irrigated lands program is the monitoring and the reporting components. A WDR does not specifically state that monitoring and certain monitoring has to be in a program. However, the non-point source implementation and enforcement policy, which is a separate policy besides the water code, applies to all sorts of programs, and that does go through the types of monitoring that is needed for any of these non-point source programs, and what the monitoring has to do in terms of verify the effective nature, be reproducible, things like that. So even though the statute doesn't say specifically for a WDR the types of monitoring that has to be there, there are separate policies that are in place, and that is broad in nature. Monitoring does not just refer to water quality samples. It also refers to different types of monitoring, such as photo monitoring, assessing a stream bank if a stream is by your property. So all different types of monitoring like that. A conditional waiver in the statute, it does have some specific language about the types of monitoring that needs to be in such a program. Another point that we come across sometimes is what type of monitoring is then available to the public. I'll talk about this a little bit later when I talk about how monitoring is reported. In a conditional waiver, it does specifically state that monitoring results shall be made public. And then WDR, again, it does not specifically state that. And in practice, these results can be made public through the Public Records Act. And there also is a provision of the Water Code that does say certain information would not be disclosed, such as business and proprietary information. However, over the years, the water boards have kind of limited what is proprietary in nature as the years have gone by. Next slide, please. So enforcement. Enforcement is a big issue and a good question on what could you guys be seeing, especially in the move to a WDR. So once enforcement actions start, it actually goes to the enforcement branch of the State Water Board. So it would not be done by necessarily the regional board or those that you are working with on an irrigated lands program. One of the big issues with enforcement that everyone should be aware of is the burden is on the landowner, the grower, to prove that you are not causing or contributing to an exceedance. You bear the burden to produce the sampling, the monitoring, the results, whatever evidence you need to show that your operation is in compliance with the permit. So there are a lot of different levels of enforcement. The first level, as Jody was mentioning, that we have seen over the last 10 plus years is just looking at, are people enrolled or not? And then are people submitting the forms that they're supposed to be submitting and submitting those with the compliance deadlines. Then we are now seeing a move toward egregious actors or big operations, and when it's very easy to see if someone is doing something non-routine that allows a big discharge. So that's kind of been the iteration. So it kind of is trickling down now more as more and more reporting, especially with the nitrogen applied and removed reporting, to see who are outliers, as Jody mentioned as well, and kind of focusing now more on quote unquote the bad actors. So these can be little things from just a informal communication to a notice of violation. If you have something like a cleanup and abatement order, which is a separate process through the regional board, you have to clean up the water and and also provide replacement water or money for replacement water funds. Now, a cease and desist order would be, that includes also not only the actual action of discharging, but if you are threatening to discharge in violation of the permit, and then you will get, you have to comply with the provisions of obviously the permit and the terms of the cease and desist order usually includes a time schedule for that compliance and any sort of remedial action that needs to be taken to fix the problem. And then the penalties and the enforcement actions go all the way up to the regional boards. For an extremely egregious action, can pass it off to the Attorney General through enforcement through the Superior Courts. Now, public perception. So waivers came about, and there was a big legislative change in 2003. And previous to that, a lot of the conditions in a conditional waiver were very not very strict, we'll put it that way. And so there has been a public perception, especially for those critical of agriculture, that a conditional waiver does not actually have requirements or conditions on irrigated agriculture, and therefore that it has been equated with non-regulation. WGRs typically have been viewed to have more prescriptive requirements, and so they are typically seen as more favorable. Next slide, please. What I should note, payment of fees applies to both. Here's just a quick overview of the regions throughout the state that have conditional waivers. The asterisks next to them just let you know that those areas are moving to a WDR or multiple WDRs. The waste discharge requirements, obviously, those are all the ones that currently have them in board or on board. In development and North Coast, all of these are somewhat different in terms, obviously, of what the focus is for the main constituent of concern, whether it be sediment or nitrates or pesticides. They also take different approaches, whether it be by specific geographic areas or by specific commodities. And I'm going to focus on, real quick, because I know we're running short on time, on the Central Valley and the Central Coast. Next slide, please. So the Central Valley, as Jody mentioned, this is where the East San Joaquin WDR arose. It was the first of all of the Central Valley long-term irrigated lands permits. This one was adopted in 2013. The State Water Board issued its decision in 2018, giving all regional boards throughout the state 5 years until February of 2023 to revise their irrigated lands program, or create one if they don't have one already, that includes all of the precedential requirements. So here are just a few of the requirements within the Central Valley orders. So obviously surface water and groundwater monitoring, your farm plans, the domestic well monitoring and notification. So this is the monitoring of nitrates in all domestic wells on an ag property. If it exceeds the nitrate drinking water standard or is in even 80% of that, then there is required notification to the regional board as well as any users of that water. As Jody mentioned, the nitrogen management plans were expanded to be irrigation and nitrogen management, and that includes the reporting of nitrogen applied divided by nitrogen removed and nitrogen applied minus removed, as well as any sort of outliers and all the calculations for that. Sediment and erosion control, education, and field level reporting. Now, what was put into the East San Joaquin, and this was new, and I should mention that this program is a third-party program in which growers belong to a third party and pay those associated fees similar to what you guys have here. And then the third party is the intermediary between the grower and the regional board. So the third party is the one compiling the reports and passing those on to the regional board. Part of this change with the East San Joaquin is the expansion of the public reporting. And so it's the first time that field level reporting is now required. However, they do have anonymous and identifiers put on there, but even so, field level management practice data is reported, field level nitrogen data by APN, and then also aggregated township nitrogen data. If you do not have a third party, though, none of that is by anonymous ID. Oh, and also rather than field level, edge of field sampling, the way that the Central Valley orders are written is that groundwater quality management plans or surface water quality management plans are triggered if there is an exceedance. And that's for the whole watershed area. And those are very intense monitoring plans that have a lot of different requirements to get to that whole area. Since Jody mentioned, there's a lot of issues with field level sampling. Next slide. The Central Coast is just taken a very, very different approach to regulation of irrigated lands. For the most part, it's all individual compliance. So the growers are the ones reporting directly to the regional board. So all of their information is public. There is a third-party program that is not at all like the Central Valley, and that's typically just for the groundwater and surface water monitoring. So they have a lot of the same. Obviously, they had to include when they were adopted last year the presidential East San Joaquin monitoring. They did add on, instead of just the domestic well water monitoring and notification for nitrates, they did add 123 TCP. As many of you guys all know, growers are not applying that. And it's a legacy issue, but they decided to have growers be the ones that fund the testing to get that information. And then the extremely different target or direction that this Central Coast did was nitrogen fertilizer application targets and limits and nitrogen discharge targets and limits. So this has all these calculations, and I won't bore you on how they get to this, but for the nitrogen discharge targets and limits by 2051, all growers cannot only apply 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. It does not matter what crop you're growing, that is the limit. And then the application targets, it's a ratchet down system. They have a certain number of years to do 85% and then get up to 90% of these targets and limits. And if these are failed to meet, so failure to meet the numeric targets, the numeric interim quantifiable milestones, or the numeric limits of any of these, individuals will have to do field level groundwater or surface water discharge monitoring. And that is my last slide.
Thank you, Carrie. So we're going to hold, can you turn my mic on? Sorry. Thank you. So we're going to hold questions just in case we are able to answer them in the upcoming commentary. One of the things I want to start out with is to say that we had a spammer in the chat, which means we've done a fantastic job of getting the word out to people that this meeting is happening. And I want to thank the Ventura County Agricultural Association and CoLab for also spreading this to their members so that everybody, even if they're not a member of VCALG or they're not a member of Farm Bureau, can make sure that they're aware of these risks and opportunities. To that end, I want to mention that, Jody and and Carrie's work on this is not covered by VCALG fees. So if you're a grower that is involved in VCALG and you're not a Farm Bureau member, I'd like to encourage you to consider membership in Farm Bureau, because we are working on behalf of you and a practical regulatory framework as advocates, which is not included in VCALG. VCALG is an administrator of a program that speaks toward what's practical to administer the program. But in terms of working on behalf of farmers, we're committed to that through the Farm Bureau system. You don't have to be a Farm Bureau member to be involved in this at all. So I do have a sign-up sheet. If you heard about this meeting in another way and you want to continue hearing about the updates on the work that we're doing, fill out this sign-up sheet or put your email in the chat to the presenters. You don't have to share it to everyone. And we'll make sure that you're getting the information, even if you're not interested in being a Farm Bureau member, because we really want to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity to be involved in the democratic process. So can you pass, or can you? So what I want to do is kind of talk about what is the effect on farmers. Jody did a great job of talking about what the regulatory framework looks like and what some of the weaknesses are in the program that exists, and also what we think is the most strategic way to move forward in terms of a practical regulatory framework that allows an opportunity to comply through best management practice implementation rather than just continuous monitoring. But I think there's also a perspective of farmers to be spoken about here to hopefully give you guys an understanding of why it's important for you individually. So individual monitoring plans are not well defined. We don't know what compliance means in a lot of these places, and it'll be individual farmers whose TMDLs kick off sooner than everyone else who have to go through setting precedents and negotiating individually with the water board in order to create those definitions through experience. And if you can imagine the burden on the individual farmer, and it could just be your neighbor that decides what the program looks like because they ended up submitting information that didn't need to be submitted, and the water board decided that they wanted that information from everyone now. And so, that's a really important part of making sure that we have a cohesive message and that we're coordinated. Additionally, because of some of these constituents that the thresholds are so low, the monitoring can be extremely expensive, between $200 and $450 per sample, and multiple samples would definitely be required during every stormwater event and through multiple dry weather sampling incidences as well. The thing that worries me most, I'm kind of going fast because we're running out of time, is this kitchen sink approach that has been created. Because there are parts of the regulatory framework that are not enforced, the only way for the staff to show that they're making progress on their own goals is to add more requirements. So every time it gets opened, they add more things, more reports, so that the board gets information back, because there's no activity going on to make sure that that there's some of the areas are enforced that Jody went over. So it's not that we're asking for enforcement. We're not. What we're asking for is a strong coalition of growers that are participating in the system, enrolled, doing their classes, and filling out, the minimum required paperwork to show that they're in good faith complying with the system. What I think we're going to end up getting is more and more and more requirements built into a big stack of paper that then, when the mood changes, can now be enforced upon. And we did not necessarily intervene at the points that were required because it wasn't on people's radar, because they weren't getting enforced on. And so that's my concern right now, and why we wanted to do this outreach, is to say, look, even though it's unlikely you're going to get a $5,000 a day bill because the mood right now is not to enforce, these requirements are going to be baked into the system that then later could turn into that $5,000 a day bill when the water board gets more funding or more staff, or they have new leadership, or something changes, right? And so now is the time, even though those bills aren't in your mailbox yet, to be logging your objections and telling your stories. Right now, as we understand it, we do not have a draft of what the ag order is going to look like. It's very impractical to comply with. During a wet weather event, it would require every lab in the Western United States to process just the samples from Ventura County. So, this gives you an idea of why it might be very, very difficult for a farmer to reasonably set up their own individual monitoring plan. Additionally, I recognize that there's risk to farmers if you're submitting data to the water board that shows exceedances for things you can't control: legacy pesticides, selenium that's naturally present in the water, bacteria that could be coming from a buffer area and not from your field. And those are things that are going to create a historical record that although you cannot be litigated against by an NGO now, will be the basis of the documentation that will be used when the laws preventing that litigation eventually are overturned. And what ends up happening, in my view, as more of the advocate, you know, Jody's the scientist and I'm like the politics person, is that the way that municipalities have been forced to comply with the stormwater is that they do point source litigation, where the NGOs file lawsuits against the municipality, and through those lawsuits, those municipalities are forced to comply, which makes sense in a municipality that is, you know, getting tax dollars, and that is the system that the US has designed. That's not reasonable for individual actors in agriculture who don't have millions of residents to spread the pain over, right? So we do not want to create a mock source point program through the agricultural irrigated lands permits. And then additionally, these are just the things that we're thinking of. You may have other insights that you want to share so that we can be your voice when you can't be there, right? That's one of the kind of touchstone phrases we use. How do we bring the grower's perspective into this? And Jody and I try to think really hard from the grower's perspective when we're looking at these regulations, but we also need you to weigh in. Hey, this is what the effect would be on me. This is what has happened to me in the past. Here's a good case study to bring in front of the water board to show the good work that farmers are doing. So helping us with that is super valuable. Do you have a comment, Fred? Do you mind coming to the mic so that the people in the webinar can hear you as well?
I'll speak really loud.
Okay, I'll reiterate your question. Go ahead.
Quick question. When we had exceedances,
Mhm.
how have we dealt an ag waiver program to those exceedances? Has there really been implementation of better practices?
There are many people who have participated in robust implementation of best management practices that we believe have impacted the water quality in the watershed. And those have been often funded by grants, right, through NRCS. And so farmers are there doing that work. Some of the work that would be considered best management practices, you're already doing because it makes sense for your business, like micro sprinklers for strawberries, you know, cutting expensive water for plant establishment by 50% also cuts runoff by 50%. Things like that, where, you know, often it's aligned with what growers need. So to answer your question, Fred, I think that oftentimes growers are making those best management implementations because it makes sense and because they care about quality water, like we all do. We all live here as well, right? And we don't believe necessarily that those exceedances need to be the motivator, or it doesn't need to be based on threats of fines to get farmers to do the right thing. If farmers have access to education and funds, 9 times out of 10, they make the investment on behalf of the general public and the benefits that exist for their businesses. So this is where you have the opportunity. I hope you understand or have the information available to understand how this impacts you and your business or your land. And if you would like to be involved in the democratic process around the formation of this ag order, these are the opportunities that are available to you. First, sharing your ideas. We need compelling case studies and background work to share with the water board in order to tell them what great work is going on and that farmers are good actors in the system. Second, there's an opportunity to serve. This is a pretty big ask, but one of our very, very best advocates, Larry Yee, the former director of the University of Davis Cooperative Extension in Ventura County, has resigned from the water board. He was the chair. And we've lost our best ag advocate with his resignation. That seat's open. And it's very important that we put good names forward to take on that role. It's a real public service, because I think you get like $250 a day, a couple days a week. So if you're feeling called, there's an opportunity. Additionally, there are other seats coming up in September and potentially in the following year. And so having a deep list of people who understand Ventura County would really improve the way that the LA Regional Water Board interacts with the regulated community. So
Aren't they appointed by the governor?
So to answer Director Nauman's question about whether or not they are appointed by the governor, there is an extensive conflict of interest screening and then they are additionally appointed by the governor, and I think their terms are 2 years, maybe 4 years. So not everybody's going to qualify, even if you want to serve, but if you are interested, we will help you understand what those eligibility requirements are. The July 14th is the next water board meeting. The June 10th meeting, where they were going to address the Rocketdyne nuclear cleanup in Simi Valley, was canceled. And this is a really important point in how we communicate about the ag order. The water board is distracted by a lot of concerned citizens about how that cleanup is happening. And additionally, there's some discussions around a bribery investigation for some water board members. And so we are at risk of just not being high enough on the priority list. And so if staff are not directed to make it a priority to do good work on the ag order, they will absolutely have their time used on other areas that are also of high importance. And so showing up at the water board meeting, testifying at the water board meeting, even if you're repeating what the guy before you said, is an important part of showing that the agricultural community is involved and that there's a lot of stake in the ag order. So we need to be just as communicative about why this is important so that we can be in the top of mind for the directors. If you're not comfortable doing that, I think that there's some letter writing that could be done. Maybe it's one letter with everybody's logo. Maybe it's everybody writing an individual letter, but at least it's something to show, hey, there are people that are watching and interested and affected by your decision. Additionally, there'll be fall workshops where the water board will speak directly to growers. It's important that we have growers that are asking tough questions, right? So that we can really understand what the requirements are and how they affect you. And they can hear from the permitted entities, i.e. farmers and landowners in Ventura County, how the regulations affect them. And I think through that process, it can be really eye-opening. Something that makes sense in paper when you're in your office when you're really understanding how it would be implemented in the field, people are open-minded to making it practical if they understand why. And hearing from growers is a lot more powerful than them hearing from Jody or I. And then again, in the late fall, there'll be adoption of the ag order. So that is pretty much my request to say, if you want to be involved, we're willing to do the work to help you feel comfortable, whether that's helping you draft a letter or helping you work on your testimony or helping you create a document that's submitted to, show a case study or a BMP that you have created on your ranch. And the real motivation behind that is to show the directors that ag is a good actor and that we we can handle the responsibility of an alternative to individual monitoring. So our last speaker, we're going to hear from a couple of growers. We have our chair of the VCALG steering committee, Edgar Terry. And then unless there's an orchard emergency, a short statement from Ted Grether, who's the current president of the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. Ed, I'd welcome you to the podium.
I'll come up here, unlike Fred. Or we want me to come over here?
Just for the webinar people to hear.
Okay. Thank you, Maureen. So when Rob Roy back in 2006 nudged me to say, why don't you throw your name in for chair of the steering committee? I don't know if you remember that, Rob, or not, and I did. And so I've been the chair of the steering committee ever since of VCALG. And I've learned a lot about all kinds of things when it comes to water and the iterations that go on and the hard work that, Rex Laird, John Christ, and now Maureen McGuire and Jody are doing here. And the benefit of the waiver process was everything was anonymous. We worked really hard through educational things over the last 20 years, basically, for growers to get out there, learn about BMPs, submitting BMP processes, and creating kind of a framework for the growers within Ventura County to work within. And now we've got to a point where the anonymity may go away, and we're going to have a specific ag order thrown at us here in the not too distant future. As Maureen says, we don't exactly know what's going to be in it, but the most important thing is the growers of Ventura County need to get together with the VCAA, the Farm Bureau, CoLab, whatever organization, and we need to be there at the table to direct this. And we can be our own best advocates here, or we can let somebody drive the train for us. And certainly I don't like people driving the train for me. I want to make sure that my thoughts and needs and concerns are out there. So consequently, I want to reinforce the points that Maureen made, that we need to make public comments. You can't be afraid to stand up and talk in front of people and explain your situation, what you do and what you're doing to be a good actor, as they say. You need to send letters on behalf of your organization. You need to also, I would say, take part. I would encourage, as Maureen said, if you're not a member of the Farm Bureau, which has been leading the charge here with the VCAL group, to think about joining Farm Bureau, because a lot of the things they're doing aren't covered by the fees that you get assessed. And so consequently, it's important, I think, that we all join and make sure that those costs can get covered and that advocacy can get covered. So, in summary, just quick points. We can either have people dictate to us how we end up complying with this ag order, or we can help make sure that the ag order isn't so onerous that none of us will be able to ever comply with it. We don't want this to head down the road for our legacy after we're all retired, saying, what the heck did our parents or grandparents do here? They just left us with a bag of stuff. So thanks.
Ted, you're welcome to come up if you're ready.
Hi, everyone. I would just add that coming up here goes against every fiber of my being to repeat something that has already been said. But I completely agree with Edgar Terry, and that we all need to make our voices heard, even if it's repeating the same point over again. It's just that we all have a story. We all have a similar story, even though they might be in different frameworks of regulation. But we don't want our stories not to be heard. So even if it is against what we believe in, and just repeating ourselves or seeming like that voice is not necessarily heard in front of everyone, you need to be heard in front of everyone, just so your situation is understood. That's it. Thanks.